I'm Rick Longinati, the co-chair of Campaign for Sustainable Transportation, and we are doing a dive into land use policy and affordable housing policy because, in our work, we've discovered we've been sort of, dealing with the tip of the iceberg, which is, a real commute problem on Highway 1. That's how our group got started in opposing highway expansion back in 2002 was when the group was started. But that congestion on Highway 1 is really a result of land use disparities. We have jobs in one area, we have housing in another, and so we have congestion. And so we are really in favor of our local transportation leaders to make it a priority to involve themselves in affordable housing development and in land use policy, so that we're not putting housing in auto-dependent locations and we're not putting jobs in auto-dependent locations, so that those locations could be accessed by public transit, because that's the future that we want to go in. So Mike Guth is part of this series. We started with the Walkable City, viewing the video with Jeff Speck, and it's very relevant to what Mike's talking about now, because this Santa Cruz County is looking at an update to its general plan and zoning ordinance. And the idea of walkable communities that would be connected by transit is part of the goals of that planning, if not the actual implementation. And that's what we're dealing with now. Mike has been a longtime member of the Sierra Club Executive Committee, including chair of the Executive Committee at some point. And Mike was on the Planning Commission for the county for, I believe, 8 years. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike. Thanks for coming, Mike.
Thanks, Rick. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sustainable Santa Cruz County Plan, a plan that was completed a while ago. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the coming regulations that are to implement that plan, discuss whether or not they do and what the concerns are. And I'm not going to talk so much about the philosophy of livable cities. I think we're kind of in tune with that. I'm trying to stick to about a half an hour. I think you could spend all morning on the concept of livable and walkable cities. But that was the general thrust of the Sustainable Santa Cruz Corridors Plan. As a community, I think that the decisions that we face are, do you want no or limited growth? Do you want to have unlimited growth wherever money will build it? Or do you want to channelize your growth with the hope of having an end product where you've put people in places where they have non-auto transportation alternatives or routing, which includes separated bike lanes, sidewalks, especially bus routes, and the like. And that housing gets in near schools and near parks, preferably both, and the like. So with that, I'm gonna, and of those three options, I don't believe that we have an option of no growth in this state. The county's planning authority is delegated to it from the state. It's the state that has the authority, and the amount of rules coming down mandated by the state down into communities is so immense with regard to mandated housing that I believe that the best route is to focus and shape it into spots so that 10, 20 years from now, we have a livable result. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share screen. Let me see if I can do this. Guess I'll ask people if they can see that.
Yes.
Great. So I made this on a really big screen, so some of it might be small now that I see it on my laptop. I'm going to go over a few things. Let me go ahead here. Okay, let's see if I can do the Sustainable Transportation Corridors Plan began in 2012. It originally came from a state grant. We got $450,000 in money for a state grant And this was corridors planning work. That was the state grant mandate. And I will tell you that the word corridors has left the project. And as soon as it did, it started making me concerned that instead of focused development, we might get diffuse mush. And I'm still concerned about that, and I'll go into that in a little bit. There were community workshops, which many of you all that I see attended in 2012 to 2014. And the board finally approved the Sustainable Santa Cruz County Plan in January of 2015. So we're 6 years in without a single implementing regulation or general plan change. And we're 9 years into the project. But this even goes back further. So I was planning commissioner for quite a while, but before that, I was on the Housing Advisory Commission, and we worked this issue heavily in 2003, but we're unable to get it into the housing element as we'd hoped as a commission. And I was a District 1 representative, along with Kathy Sweet of SoCal, both representing Jan Buttes. That's District 1 because District 1 does cover much of the area that's at play in this discussion. Okay, let me go on. So I'm intermixing cuts from the plan with some of my comments here. Guiding principles that you see there are from the plan. The bold part is there's another page of them, but I think that the important ones are focused development, transportation choices, and unique community character. And if you look at the bottom here, here's my view of the shorthand of the 8 or 9 guiding principles. You plan for infill, including high density infill in a manner that is not auto-centric, along transportation corridors, while being sensitive to existing community character. And I put in the exclamation point because I was like, hey, no problem, right? We can do this. But it's really quite a community task. With these guiding principles, questions come up. The guiding principle is to put new development should be compact and located primarily within existing urban areas. Urban areas aren't defined in this plan. The county has what's called an urban services line, which is very broad. So that's something that I'll get back to and we'll look at in some of the maps. The other thing that it says in the unique community character is that it says that we should provide infrastructure efficiently. My view is one needs an infrastructure skeleton through selected areas that then are also co-located with allowable high density, including higher building infill. That the county has limited resources. It can't put proper infrastructure everywhere. You got to co-locate it. So those are just a few of the things. This is the second, the rest of the guiding principles. I think the one really important one here is housing options. County has a deficit of certain kinds of housing, there's no doubt. There's plenty of housing for rich people that can afford second vacation homes. There's less and less affordable housing. And I don't mean legal affordable housing. I mean non-legally constrained, but nonetheless relatively inexpensive housing. And it's because by and large it gets demolished for new projects. So housing options is an important thing. If you all don't know, here's a picture of the county. I'll use, can you all see my cursor, Rick?
Yes.
Okay, so there's the county in dark. The yellows are the cities, which are not under county planning jurisdiction. The red lines up in the mountains, those are rural service boundaries. The county generally has 2 sets of codes for each category. One is what are the rules within the urban services line and the rural services line, and what are the rules outside of the urban services line. So the question is, when the plan says in urban areas, does it mean all of the area within the urban services line, or areas as you drive through the county that seem to be the urban centers? Something that is an ongoing discussion. Here's the sustainable plans project area, and that's specific. So it was only this area, but this is the county's, a portion of the county's urban services line. And then you will notice that if you're talking about transportation and flow and planning in this area, this huge carve out is the city of Capitola, which is not subject to county planning jurisdiction, nor is it part of this plan. Keep that in mind. This is more in a map sense for those of you that are familiar with it. Highway 1, Capitola, New Brighton, Pleasure Point, Opal Cliffs. And for later, when I talk about some development on 17th, I just want you to notice that these blue dots, these are schools. The general plan now already makes discussion about where development should be focused in broad terms, near schools, transportation corridors, shopping, medical facilities, those kinds of things. But how much of that is codified into the building regulations? I would say not much. Okay, I'm gonna go a little further. This is a map from the county's plan, the one adopted in 2015. And this one shows what are viewed as regional employment centers. And I think especially important are neighborhood activity centers. Where do people want to go from home besides work? I'm going to take an aside here. I spoke at Rick's Transportation Justice Conference a few years ago, and I pointed out that I view land use planning as like one of the key aspects of having a livable community. And no matter how much you provide people with alternative transportation, you have to keep in mind that families want to get their kids to school, people need to get to work. And then also, though, they go to these, what I would call neighborhood activity centers. Go down to the next page. When I was reminded yesterday, I hadn't looked at this in a while, of where the population is in this mid-county area. I think there's two really important things to see here. One is, where is the population density? But also, where is it not relative to corridors? How underdeveloped are those corridors, and how open are they to be areas where we channelize in a fledgling high-density infill community? So even though the concentrations speak to what is going on now, we also should keep in mind what kind of regulations and zoning maps and codes do we want to have that could possibly change these concentrations. This next one is employment concentrations. Where do people work? And I'm going to go back. You'll notice that they don't overlap much. So that's an interesting starting point. We'll just do that again. People live here, but they don't work there. So these are just some existing conditions that I think are important for us to be aware of. Now, this is the corridors. These are the corridors that were identified in the plan. I'm going to mention again, we got a state grant to plan for sustainable corridors, and we've got a plan that doesn't say corridors in its title, and we've got pending updates that are called sustainability updates that don't seem to hearken too much to corridors. And I'm hoping, my view is that we as a community, as we go forward and review and approval of the coming county changes, is to steer them back to paying attention to these corridors. So for those of you that can't see that quite clearly, SoCal, 17th, 41st, much of which is in Capitola, Portola, Bromer, Capitola. I'm going to do an aside now and to show a recent development in one of those corridors areas that didn't require any of the pending updates to the corridors plan to be able to get put in. Here's a live oak map, Highway 1 and 17th coming down. There's Highway 1, there's 17th coming down. This is Capitola Road. The red circle is one of the larger undeveloped lots left in the middle of Live Oak. Here's a picture of it more close up. These other things that I have on this overhead map, 17th Avenue, where I have this white line, and Capitola Road, where I have this white line, this parcel is right on Capitola Road, almost right on 17th. Each of those streets have 2 bus lines. There's the elementary school and there's the middle school. True, pretty safe, close, walking distance for kids. So what gets put into this parcel, and this is a good thing, it's not a trick, high density, 100% affordable housing. This is one of the better projects that I was lucky enough to vote in favor of while I was a planning commissioner. This is commercially zoned land, though, and that's a trick, that got rezoned on its rear half for a residential combining district. I don't expect you all to know what those things mean. I'll talk about them a little bit later. And here's part of it. This is a side view of 3-story housing. Within our combining district, you can go to 3 stories. Typical development in residential zones is limited to 2 stories in the county. One of the questions that comes up is if you want to make corridor infill, do we want to let housing go up? You're going to have more people, you either go out or up. Up puts things closer to corridors. It's a decision for the community, but it's one or the other. My concern all along has been whether or not we would have high density sprawl away from the corridors, which I think defeats the ability to have a well-used, well-designed infrastructure skeleton of alternative transportation. I don't even like using the word alternative, transportation other than cars. Okay, so here's a great project, in my view. Done, didn't need the sustainability update. Question is, do you want to start allowing rezoning along these corridors where residential can all just go to 3-story, for example, as part of this update? I'm doing an aside, and as I was telling Rick earlier, 30 minutes, I have to just jump a hodgepodge back and forth. Here's a corridor, here's pictures of the corridors that are identified. Back in 2012, I worked with Don Kennedy, who was working Greenways to Schools at the time, and he and I did a picture study of the corridors in the corridors plan to highlight their deficiencies. We had dozens of pages of things like this. Deputy Bolger might be interested to see that this is viewed as like as pedestrian. I mean, this is just so substandard and inadequate. So part of a corridors plan is who's going to upgrade the infrastructure for pedestrians and for bikes. Are developers going to pay for it on a piecemeal basis as they develop individual lots? Or is the county going to knuckle under and take care of these areas? Here's an overhead view of Live Oak and SoCal. And we're talking corridor areas that basically go like this. And anyway, something to keep in mind, the county has here's the urban services line. You see how the houses end here? There's a little perk out for Santa Cruz Gardens. There's a question for you all. Is this all an urban area that should be allowed to use custom rezoning designations on a project by project basis for high density, as long as there was somebody that could find cheap land, even if in an inappropriate place? Or do we want to focus into certain areas? I know that was a bit of a loaded question. This is what zoning maps look like if you haven't seen them. This is a top level map. It's actually zoned down to the lot by lot level. little bit closer view is something like this in Pleasure Point. I'm a great believer that communities that are the residential communities should have a whole smattering. I know you can't really see it here, but there's C1 zones. On all these different corners, there's C1 zones where there's old-fashioned corner stores. I'm a great believer that in having those, person can walk to the corner to get something that they need or ride their bike. Anyway, these are zoning maps if you're not familiar with them. For these zoning maps, I am so sorry. Okay. There are uses. The uses which start here and go for page after page, starting with A, accessory structures, and then going to every kind of building. Talk about what's allowed on the different zoning. There's different kinds of residential, mountain, beach, single family residential, rural residential, and agricultural residential. Almost all development is done through administrative approval because the property is already zoned for the use. Most development gets approved through building permits. These are single family and smaller houses, duplexes. No hearing. Then you get up to hearings when you get larger projects, zoning administrator. But these are administrative approvals where you look at the level of compliance of the project to the existing zoning's code structure. If you go to a scheme where you're going to rezone each parcel as it comes up, or you have to get a new designation that's been created, but not yet laid on that parcel, it's no longer administrative. It's legislative approval for the rezoning. A body such as a planning commission or a board of supervisors or a city council can vote against rezoning simply because they, as a matter of policy, don't think that zoning is appropriate there. If you don't rezone areas, for example, along the corridors in advance, that means that every developer that wants to do stuff that might require a rezoning has to spend millions of dollars on property that's not zoned right, and then has to roll the dice they get a rezoning. All right, the general plan already points out that if you're going to rezone to higher density, you should be near mass transit and near neighborhood community or regional commercial. I can assure you that what near mass transit means can be robustly argued at every hearing. Here's the focus areas that the Sustainable Santa Cruz Plan identified, sort of the key, most important areas we're going to get special attention. It's Upper 41st, Medical District by the hospital, SoCal just below the freeway, and 17th Avenue. These are what they look like in detail. According to the plan, any of these areas in black outlines are currently one zoning and should be rezoned. The ones that don't have outlines around them already have a zoning type that's appropriate in accord with this plan going forward. So areas that are in black are identified for rezoning. The question is, in the coming months and year, when they do the sustainability update, are they going to rezone these? I wish I could give you the answer, but the maps aren't out yet. My suspicion is they won't, but let's hope I'm wrong. Here's in the hospital district. This week, the hospital went in. That's a 60-story building. That's a 3-story parking garage. It's within the medical district focus area, according to and it is, the staff report is correct. I just wanted to note that although this project was within the medical district, which is that district in the plan, the proposed Kaiser facility is not. So this becomes another issue we're going to see with plans that don't rezone in advance. People are going to try to put stuff that's not quite in concert with the plan, and there's going to be big fights. That's my concern. I do believe that we'll be all well served if there's some rezoning as part of this process. Here's the south of SoCal portion, and you don't see a 6-story medical facility in here. Certain areas are to be rezoned. just keep moving. I'm looking at the clock. This is the quarter of 41st and SoCal. 41st and SoCal is part of the sustainability plan. This whole black end area is proposed to get the new workplace flex zoning, which they are creating the zoning. Whether or not they'll assign it to the map as part of this process, we don't know. I do want to point out that here's where the car lot was proposed. That is a C2 area now. The plan calls for it to keep being C2, but a project came along with a money developer. They wanted rezoning in conflict with the plan. The county recommended approval and said that it was compliant to the Sustainable Santa Cruz County Plan. Not only was it clearly non-compliant on zoning, of the 16 criteria for that corner for what should be there in the plan, that proposed use clearly could not even close to make 13 of the 16 criteria. So once again, rezoning and spot zoning is a real, I'm going to say tricky, I should say poor approach to doing the work. I strongly think everybody's better served if the zoning gets done as part of the sustainability update, and then we really are careful not to deviate from it. Here I put in future street stuff from the plan, and I'm not going to go into this too much because county planning doesn't control where Public Works and the board decides to put in streets. That's part of the county's capital improvement plan, and this has to be monitored separately. So now that I've talked about the plan, showed some projects that have been going on, let's get to the update that's pending. If you don't know, the sustainability policy and regulatory updates, referred to as the sustainability update, all of this language is straight from the county now, is going to have amendments to the general plan, the code, and county design guidelines. It's ongoing. It's had a notice of preparation for DEIR work. I've been unable to get the details of the code changes, only summaries, some of them fairly descriptive, but not complete. So here's some questions that I have with regard to the coming year of implementation that I'd like to share with you. If it's true that we're going to have highly customized amendments to individual focus areas, the question for me is, are they going to customize it by rezoning these focus areas or doing designations, or are they going to do that on an ad hoc project by project basis? Will there be map changes as part of this update? And if so, you can use administrative authority and not legislative authority. That may be subtle to some of you, but let me tell you that you can vote against a project on legislative authority simply because you feel it doesn't fit. Whereas if you vote for or against it under administrative authority, you have to see whether it's substantially compliant to the rules. One of the questions is, if we really are trying to focus infill along corridors, and we understand we can't stop development, we just are going to try to put it in certain places. Will the development be better encouraged to rezone those areas now, letting moneyed investors know it's okay to do it there and going to be tricky to do it in other places? And of course, my question is it really planning if you have to do rezoning for every project? There's some really good development standard changes proposed in the update. In case I sounded too negative recently, really good ones. One is residential flex zone district. And this is this sort of fits into that the missing middle of housing. And I'll get into it more in a second. And the other one is the workplace flex zone district, which is another way to mix up office and commercial stuff in a way that is more modern. The county used the example of the refurbished Sash Mill area in Santa Cruz. I'm not familiar with that, but that is one of the examples that they use. I believe these are needed, important, and useful new categories of development. These are the kinds of things that people do on commercial spaces where they have both residential and commercial, residential low, above, commercial on the corner, residential here, and the pictures here. These are the kinds of things that I believe we're well served having better, clear zoning code categories for. Of course, the question is, where do we apply those categories? But they're good categories to have. They give us more versatility. They call them zoning districts in the sustainability update. I want to draw a contrast. In Pleasure Point, this is a black lined district geographic map within which there are separate rules. The county uses the word district in a misleading way. When it's a designation, there's no district with any boundary. They just find some lot that they want to use that kind of zoning approach, development approach, and they rezone it as part of a district when it's really a designation. So when you review this stuff going forward, be careful to discern whether or not when they refer to something as a district, is there a mapped district anywhere? I believe we're well served by mapped districts. So here's the sort of the transportation pattern flow. I think Rick could probably talk much more detail than I on this, but you've got to integrate the development. Okay, Rick, was I having a voice problem? You muted me and unmuted me.
No, that was my mistake. Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to apologize to everybody for the speed in which I'm going through this and how I'm jumping back and forth. We could go all day on planning topics, and Rick's asked me to sort of be 30, 35 minutes, and I'm at 34. So apologies if I'm moving along in sort of a scattershot fashion. Hang on, let me get back to my presentation. Okay, so now I want to get back to something we saw earlier. All amendments to development regulations will be highly customized to individual focus areas. Here they are. You saw what some of the new regulations were, WorkFlex and LiveFlex. We have yet to see whether or not the will exists to rezone the parcels, at least that they already identified for rezoning, or including other ones along underdeveloped areas of the corridors. One of the questions, now getting back to infrastructure, is who provides it. I showed this picture. You see this sidewalk that went in front of Ocean Honda when they redeveloped, and then it ends right here. Well, at that time, and in many places in the county doesn't put in the infrastructure. They create a plan line that shows a sidewalk there, and every new development has to put in their portion of the sidewalk. When you're in a wheelchair here, it doesn't really help you that this as yet redeveloped lot doesn't have anything for you to get across. So who provides infrastructure? This is why, getting back to the infrastructure skeleton, the more limited it is in location because you've co-located high density housing, the more you can focus the limited county money to do good things for infrastructure in those chosen corridor areas. And then I'll just leave it with this. What decision, these are decisions for the community. What approach do you want to take with regard to future development and infill? Infill within the entire urban services line, which I pointed out to you is quite large. And I do believe that you could find housing advocates that don't want to draw lines around these corridors because they view the need for housing as so dire, or higher density infill focused along corridors. And if so, are projects evaluated on a case-by-case basis, or are we going to map out areas and give them relaxation in advance? And here's one for thought. I believe a more regulated approach actually leads to more development, not less, because it takes a lot of the risk out of the people who have the money, so they don't have to get into community fights about policy. Okay, with that, I'm going to thank you all for listening, and I'll turn it back over to Rick.
Thank you very much, Mike. Yeah. And I want to invite people to chime in with comments and questions. And before you do, I just want to underline some of the things that triggered off for me when Mike was talking. You know, one of the things was, you know, if we are interested in affordable housing in our community, does it make sense to, you know, create this giant risk for developers who want to develop a project when they don't know whether they're going to get the rezoning that will allow them to do what they're planning to do. The other thing was, you know, infrastructure, you know, that missing piece of sidewalk or the missing bike lanes or, you know, where I'm in a moment of grief right now because all the developer fees for the past several years in the city of Santa Cruz, all the traffic impact fees that developers pay on new projects are going to expand the intersection of Highway 1 where it crosses River Street. You know, it's a very expensive project, and we have lots of missing sidewalks, lots of missing bike lanes in Santa Cruz, and the injury rates to show it. So it's really a political question about whether the infrastructure gets built. And well, before I don't want to forget mentioning this, but you know, make sure if you're motivated on these issues that have to do with affordable housing, that have to do with sustainable transportation, get involved with the Sierra Club is for sure going to be working on this around the county issues and the campaign for sustainable transportation. So with that, I'll invite, see Len, you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you, Mike. That was a great presentation and so many good points in there, but I wanted to focus on, you showed that, you know, in order to implement the sustainable plan, the county's got to do some general plan amendments. They've got to come up with some new ordinances that fit it and then design guidelines. And I 100% agree with you that if you make the regulations more specific and concrete and definite, it actually takes a lot of risk out of development. It also clarifies what's going on, and it usually speeds the design process because developers have to fit within those design parameters. And I've been reading a lot of form-based codes from other jurisdictions, which seem to capture all of that in one. And what strikes me a lot about them is that they're very specific about their circumstances. So some cities, you know, they say, hey, this whole stretch from here to here of this city is designated for whatever you want mixed use. As long as it's got some residential and some commercial, you can do it basically within whatever, you know, height limit they've set, like Hartford, Connecticut, for example. And other cities, it's very, very constrained. So they might say the height limit is based on the lot depth. Well, you can say that whole zone is one zone, but the height limits within that zone vary because the lot depth varies. So they've all adapted rules to make this stuff work for their specifics. And so, you know, I guess my question is sort of two-part. Do you think that the county's going to move in the direction of developing those kind of standards? And if not, you know, what can we do to try and push them in that direction?
Oh, I appreciate the question. So I would say, do I think? So for the last at least 2 years, and I know one of my colleagues when I was on the planning commission, Judith is here, but I used to always, you know, specifically ask the planning director when we got the sustainability update, meaning the work that they've been doing for so many years, are there going to be lines on maps and redesignations? And there was never a yes answer. So I took that question to Supervisor Leopold so he could take it more directly. No, senior staff doesn't really have to answer a planning commissioner's question, but a supervisor, and my understanding of his discussion with her was that there wouldn't be. Now, because of the pressure coming on from different people, and I'm not the only person nor he that had this concern, it might have evolved somewhat since, but I don't think that they're going to do the work. My concern is that you make these great flexible designations, but then you don't lay them in because I don't know, I'm almost feeling like they're afraid to do it. You know, it's transformative. You've got to take the step. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of your question, but I'm not aware that they're doing this along these regions. My concern is they are not.
And the second part was just what, you know, where and how can we put pressure if we want to see those kind of changes?
The Board of Supervisors has ultimate authority on approving all of these updates. So ultimately it's the board. However, your planning commissioners also get study sessions and can give good feedback earlier on. But it's really a matter to take to your county supervisor.
Thank you, Len. I see Ron and then Rafa, and if you want to raise your hand, would you please use the reactions button on the bottom of your screen? If you go in there, you can do the hand raising. That'll make it easier for me to see it. So Ron?
Oops, yeah. Mike, first of all, I appreciate what you said about how tangled the transportation element is, even such a little thing as a sidewalk. And Rick, when you mentioned the intersection, I frequently see homeless people who are staying in the shelter just to the northwest corner of Highway 9 and Highway 1, struggling their way across the street, sometimes pushing carts and things like that, while there's umpteen lanes in every which way coming and going, and people turning and, you know, left turns and right turns and all that. And as they're considering, you know, expanding and enlarging that footprint of, you know, more dense housing there, I really have to wonder if anybody's giving a second thought to the pedestrian relationship there. The other thing that's an incredible part of our infrastructure is the energy infrastructure. And I got an email yesterday and a drawing showing a project for the homeless using tiny homes in Colorado, where probably, you know, it gets cold in the wintertime. And I couldn't believe that these structures were laid out in such a way, they were running north-south to the, you know, just scattered around this lot with no thought. And if you are aware that where the sun comes up in the morning, you want the main orientation of the house to be like this, so that the sun comes in and heats the long section of the house, not the narrow section of the house. Well, when I looked at these plans you showed, I saw the same incredible lack of sensitivity. And especially when we're doing low-income housing, how is it that we're forcing low-income people to pay more than we would for heating their homes, simply because the architect didn't have the good sense to look where the sun came up in the morning to provide heat through the windows in the winter, and to also, of course, have the shading in the summertime, which is because with a south facade, there's very little sun comes on the south side, as long as you have a little overhang in the summertime.
No, it's interesting comments. I don't think there's really a question there, but I appreciate what you're saying.
Do you know any, well, it comes back to what you were saying earlier. It's the policy question. Is there an appetite on the part, for example, the city council or the board of supervisors in the county to give any impetus to these design standards, after all?
Well, I've been, so right now if you're on discretionary permits, there's issues relating to shading your neighbors.
Okay.
You know, I live in an area where I'm sitting right now that's straight ahead of me is directly south.
Mm-hmm.
So my lot goes this way predominantly. Some people's go sideways.
Mm-hmm.
If a person has a lot that goes east-west and builds the highest part of their house at the back of their lot,
Right.
person behind them gets no sun if it's a single story behind a two-story all winter long.
Right.
And my view is that height limits take into account sun angle, all because so people can both have warmth in their home and also get the health of the sun. So not quite exactly the way you've.
Well, that's a good start.
But I've hearkened on that for quite some time. Now only on discretionary permits, which means not building permits, but larger developments that come before planning commission. Shadow studies would always be part of it, for example. When I lived in Davis, boy, in the early 80s, late 70s, they had a city ordinance that talked about having passive, you had to have walls with retained heating elements in them that were on the south side so that it would heat the house after the sun went down. And I haven't seen anything like that here locally.
Yeah, I built the domes at Davis campus, and Judy Corbett with her husband did the village homes that led to those standards, and Mike was on the council. She did her thesis, her undergraduate thesis on the domes and how we used solar orientation and such at the time.
Now, I'm very familiar with the domes, and I'm sure the stories of the kinds of things that went on at the domes are all purely speculative.
We're having our 50th anniversary next year.
That's wonderful. Great.
Did solar powered homes have more fun? Okay. Thanks, Ron. Rafa, you're next.
Thanks. So I live in Santa Cruz, and I guess I'm pretty familiar with the types of planning challenges that we're facing in the city with incongruences between our zoning code and our general plan. And I guess I wanted to better understand for the unincorporated part of the county, how much work needs to be done to update, corridors so that the zoning code matches what's in the general plan. And then also I was wondering if you could explain sort of like what the timing of these various zoning updates are and what their relation to the housing element update in 2023 might be.
So good question. So some plans, not the Sustainable Santa Cruz plan, but some plans like the SoCal plan, some plans get adopted into the general plan. Some instead become a document that then leads to general plan changes and code changes. And those general plan changes are now in the general plan. Excuse me. And when we started this effort, there's no way on earth I would have thought it would have taken this long to 2021 to get to the point where we're starting to go into environmental review of sustainability changes. I'll talk a little cynically, and that they wouldn't be talking about corridors anymore, and you can't find anything in the verbal summaries of what they're putting into the EIR documents. The formal codes aren't released yet that says anything about dramatically, not even dramatically, just rezoning. The maps are part of the general plan too. So there's the text and then there's the maps. And the timing is that this has been put off for a really, really long time. I didn't go into it, but the sustainability update includes code revisions in about 40 categories of code. It became a hodgepodge catch-all for everything that was behind for the last 5 years. Much, if not most of what's in it, you couldn't find a link to sustainability thinking in it. It's just all getting pushed in there. Because of that, it becomes so large, it becomes very tricky for the public to review and give meaningful comment to their planning commissioners and supervisors and to put in input. That sounds a little cynical, huh? The timing is, it's taking them forever. I'll put it that way. I wouldn't bet money on when they're going to finish, even though they're going into scoping for the first EIR round.
But doesn't the county have to have, zoning that will accommodate our arena numbers by 2023?
Right. So that's an interesting question. So I'll try to do this in 1 minute or less. So in 2003 on the housing element, and 2004. So the Housing Commission was much more active in the housing element in the old days, but then we got so activist that they like defanged us and changed the code. So we don't have multiple hearings at the Housing Commission level anymore, because we actually tried to address problems like this. The state HCD, Housing and Community Development, would not approve our housing element as supplying the required amount of housing, or not supplying, making it so that it could be built if the money came along. They didn't share with us their analytical methods, and they kept rejecting it. I remember I was in a meeting with Laird and trying to think who else our state representatives were at the time. And anyway, we had to just find some underdeveloped blocks of land and rezone them, even though it had no relevance to real planning, for super high density, to get approval, to get a certified housing element. The sustainability update, it's a tricky thing to say that you've created flex districts that you can overlay later onto lots and say that you have a system in place that allows more housing, and by allowing high density housing, it has an increment of affordable housing, and you've met your numbers, not just for housing overall, but affordable housing is always usually the one that's the driver of the two. There's another advantage of rezoning to higher density along these corridors, is it makes it easier to meet our numbers and get an approved housing element. And if people don't know, if you don't have a certified housing element, you are not eligible to SCADs of state money. So I don't think the county can afford not to have a certified element. Rafa, it may not have answered your question, but that's sort of revolving around that topic.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rafa. Is there anybody else that has a question? And at this point, I'm looking at everybody, so raise your hand or get my attention.
You know, as a final note, I want to thank Rick. But between the Transportation Justice Conference, which the speakers to me have been so fascinating, and now doing this series, and that the work that they're doing on transportation, I just want to thank him for being active on so many fronts this way.
Oh, you're welcome, Mike. You know, it just feels to me like we're talking about some details that not everybody, is aware of, or, and they seem somewhat obscure, and but they're so important to having a community where, we have a range of people that can afford to live here, that we have a community where it's safe and easy to get around without an automobile. And those are the things that we all care about. So some of us need to pay attention to the details, and we're volunteering, people that, like, I have time on my hands at this stage in my life, and others like me. And so, but for the rest of us who, for whom you can't, devote your attention to when the Planning Commission is going to hear, these regulations, just open our emails. You get something from CFST or the Sierra Club, open it, and there's probably a way that you can contribute by signing a letter or something like that. Thanks. So since we just have a minute left, so Ron Swenson raised the question about pedestrian safety in that widening of the Highway 1 at Highway 9. And in fact, we, some of us were worried about that, and we got the Santa Cruz City Council to give direction to the public works staff. And the direction was, you need to take this project to the Transportation Commission, the citizen commission that advises on transportation, and have them look at safety. And the public works staff never did. And when they came around the next year to approve the project, and it turned out that the public works staff didn't take it to the Transportation Commission, they mumbled something about, well, we had an open house, and blah, blah, and there was a poster of the project at their open house, and that was their version of taking it to the commission. So, but the city council, it wasn't even a slap on the wrist. They approved the project. So we have an issue not only with the staff being sort of not aware of the issues of pedestrian or not prioritizing pedestrian and bicycle safety, but we have an issue of a city council that is not, that needs more backbone that to direct staff along the priorities that we all care about.
I'll share a quick example about staff. So keep in mind, I'm very admiring of the staff at the county. They're capable of doing great things. It really needs leadership from the board to push the leadership in the planning department to do these things. And ultimately that has to come from the public to push the supervisors if they are too busy with other things. But as an example, in Aptos Village, that was a huge redevelopment, and the county general plan requires new arterials like that to conform to the state bicycle design guidelines for bicycle paths, which is like 57 inches wide bike lane, some number like that, and none of them were. And I emailed Supervisor Perry, whose district it was in, asking if she, saying, hey, this isn't right, these are not compliant, and it's required to on the county general plan. So she had a million things on her plate that day for that hearing. There were so many things, but she did ask staff, hey, what about these bicycle lanes? And the answer was, these were routed to and reviewed by the RTC Bicycle Safety Subcommittee. She goes, they were. And he goes, yes. Okay, next item. So I immediately called on the phone. The head of the subcommittee was David Casterson at the time. And he goes, yeah, we reviewed them. We rejected them. So they had honestly reported that they had been reviewed by the RTC Bicycle Safety Subcommittee.
Yeah. Yeah.
So these kinds of things do happen on projects that you have to push on things.
Yeah. Democracy begins at home. Well, folks, in a minute, I'm going to thank Mike and ask you to unmute yourself so you can do that too. I just want to call your attention to next week. We have another brown bag, and it's going to be hearing from some bus drivers about how they've been coping with the pandemic. And I think the best way to thank our bus drivers is to listen to what they've been going through. So you're all invited to that same time, same station. So anybody have any appreciations for today's event? Just jump in. Go ahead, Judy.
I think it was a very thorough and complete presentation by both of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you, Judy. Gina.
Sorry I was late, but thank you. The information that I heard was really great. Gives me a little bit more ammunition, so to speak, for letter writing campaigns and how to go about push where folks need to be pushed. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you, Gina. All right, well, Mike, once again, thank you. I learned something, even though I've been trying to understand this for a while now. And let's keep working together on this. Thanks a whole lot. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Great crowd today. We had like 30, 35 people coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.